All right, we've taken a look at Chapter 1 of Fundamentals, in which Schaefer-Landau presents a number of arguments on behalf of hedonism, and we took a look at Chapter 1 in The Ethical Life. We read some selections from the work of John Stuart Mill, talked about Mill's ideas a little bit. But now let's turn to this chapter in which Schaefer-Landau presents arguments against hedonism as a theory of value. We've looked at some of the reasons that, at least at first glance, hedonism seems to have a certain common sense appeal. It does seem to be plausible, at least at first glance. It does seem believable, because a lot of things that we think of as good, it's true, they are things that tend to promote happiness. And a lot of the things that we think of as bad, it's true. They tend to be things that promote pain or unhappiness. So at first glance, hedonism would seem to be pretty plausible. But you start to think about it a little bit more, and as Schaefer-Landau shows, there are a number of substantial arguments that can be brought against it. So let's take a look at some of those. I'm just going to follow Schaefer-Landau's organization of the chapter here. He presents a series of arguments against hedonism, and I'm just going to go over them and elaborate on some of them. So the first argument that he considers, he calls the argument from the paradox of happiness. And the argument would be this: if happiness is the only thing that directly makes us better off, then it is rational to single-mindedly pursue it. Second premise: it isn't rational to do that. Therefore, conclusion, happiness isn't the only thing that directly makes us better off. Okay, so now you see why it was important that we spend that time on logic. It's important to know, first of all, whether an argument is valid. Is this argument valid? Well, yes, it is, because it's an example of modus tollens, right? We said modus tollens was the form of argument if P then Q, but it's not the case that Q. Therefore, it's not the case that P. This argument is an example of modus tollens, and so it's valid. Okay, so how is it as an argument against hedonism? It's valid, but is it sound? We still have to think about the issue: are the premises true? Now, what does it mean here? Let's pause and think about what is meant by this notion that there's a kind of paradox to the pursuit of happiness. What is meant by that? Well, there's a state of affairs that seems, at least at first glance, it seems like a contradiction. And the paradox is that, here again, if you directly pursue happiness, you will be less likely to achieve it. So that does sound kind of like a contradiction, doesn't it? That does sound kind of paradoxical, doesn't it? By pursuing happiness, you're less likely to get it. You're more likely to get happiness if you don't pursue it. That would seem to be the paradox. Or here again, to state it more precisely, if you single-mindedly pursue happiness, that is to say, you focus narrowly on the pursuit of happiness, then you're unlikely to achieve it. Paradoxically, you would be more likely to achieve happiness if you don't go after it directly. If you go after it indirectly, you're more likely to achieve it. So again, that would be the argument. If happiness is the only thing that directly makes us better off, then it's rational to single-mindedly pursue it. But it isn't rational to do that. Therefore, happiness isn't the only thing that directly makes us better off. So Schaefer-Landau gives some examples of this kind of a paradox on page 33. He says, for example, think of the professional golfer in the midst of a slump. She desperately wants to regain her swing, but the more she focuses on this, the harder it becomes. Okay, so that's a kind of paradox, isn't it? That would appear to be a kind of contradiction, wouldn't it? The harder she tries to get her swing back, the more frustrated she becomes, right? There are a lot of things like that in life, aren't there? You overthink things. You try too hard to get something. By trying too hard to get something, you actually make it less likely that you will get it. It sounds kind of like a contradiction, but it does make sense in a way, right? Some things some goods in life you just have to not go after them directly, and happiness seems to be like that. Schaefer-Landau also gives this example. Consider the immature student who wants more than anything to be well liked, and so tries way too eagerly and very annoyingly to be pals with his classmates. Such behavior is self-defeating. He'd be much better off trying less hard. So at first glance anyway, that seems like a contradiction, doesn't it? By trying hard to be friends, he's actually making it less likely that someone will want to be his friend, right? Because that kind of single-minded, narrow preoccupation with whether someone is my friend, that's a kind of very off-putting behavior, isn't it? That's, as Schaefer-Landau says, that's a kind of annoying behavior, isn't it? That would be very off-putting if somebody interacted with you in that way, right? Was very narrowly and single-mindedly and kind of obsessively focused on this question, are you my friend? That would be very off-putting behavior. That would make you really not want to be friends with that person, would it? Wouldn't it? So there is a kind of paradox involved, a kind of contradiction when it comes to the pursuit of certain goods in life. Certain goods in life, if you're preoccupied with them, if you obsess over them, if you try too hard, like the golfer trying too hard to get back or swing, you're just going to frustrate yourself. You're just going to make it less likely that you actually get that thing. And the person making this argument against hedonism as a theory of value would say something like this, I think. You're more likely to be happy if you don't pursue it directly. You're more likely to be happy if you don't aim at happiness, but if you aim at other intrinsically valuable things, if you're engaged, let me put it this way, if you aim at other goals that have value apart from the question of whether they will make you happy, just goals that have value independent of the happiness that they might bring. If you're engaged in fulfilling projects, if you're engaged in meaningful projects, and you just put the issue of happiness to the side, you just see certain goals, certain projects as having intrinsic value, and you try very hard to fulfill them, you try very hard to reach goals, it's more likely that you'll be happy by being engaged in those meaningful pursuits, isn't it? Whereas here again, if you're narrowly preoccupied with the question, am I happy? Those kinds of people, we think of that as neurotic. We think of that as a kind of unhealthily narrow preoccupation with happiness. And if you're, here again, in a kind of unhealthy way, narrowly preoccupied with it, if you're obsessed with it, then very likely you will be unhappy. So that's the thrust of the argument. That would be this argument from the paradox of happiness. There's a kind of paradox. There's a kind of contradiction in trying to pursue happiness. And therefore, hedonism is not the right theory of value. Okay, is that a good argument against hedonism as a theory of value? Well, Schaefer-Landau finds that the first premise is false, so the argument is unsound. Let's go back to the first premise and look at it again. If happiness is the only thing that directly makes us better off, then it is rational to single-mindedly pursue it. Okay, so Schaefer-Landau is saying that that's false. And he's saying that the hedonist understands that that is false. The hedonist can agree that that's false. The hedonist says that happiness is the source of all value. Happiness is the good, right? That's what we've seen. But the hedonist can say that and also understand that single-minded pursuit of happiness is likely to be self-defeating, is likely to frustrate the aim that one has of achieving happiness. The hedonist, Schaefer-Landau here is saying the hedonist can agree that one ought to go after happiness in an indirect way, just like the golfer trying to get back her swing. She shouldn't focus on getting back her swing. She should focus on other things and just wait for it to come back. Some things in life are like that. And the hedonist can agree with that and still also believe that happiness is the source of all value. Happiness is the good. So Schaefer-Landau finds that the first premise is false, and so the argument is unsound. Even if happiness is the only intrinsic good, it doesn't follow that we should single-mindedly pursue it. The hedonist can agree with that. That's Schaefer-Landau's point here. As Schaefer-Landau says, the direct pursuit of good things sometimes prevents us from getting them. But here again, the hedonist can agree with that. The hedonist can say both things, and both of those statements can be consistent, right? The hedonist can say happiness is the source of all value, and it is also the case that you shouldn't directly pursue it. You should pursue other things, and it will come as a kind of consequence or as a kind of side effect of being engaged in meaningful projects and striving to fulfill worthwhile goals. That's how you will achieve happiness. So this is really just a disagreement about how to go about achieving happiness, but that doesn't really show hedonism is false as a theory of value. So the argument doesn't pose a serious threat to hedonism. The hedonist can acknowledge that aiming directly for happiness is not a smart way to get it. The hedonist can agree with that. The hedonist can believe that happiness is the good, pleasure/happiness is the source of value, and it's unwise to aim directly at happiness. It's unwise to be preoccupied with it or single-mindedly pursue it. You ought to see it more as something that will come if you're engaged in worthwhile, meaningful, fulfilling projects and trying to achieve worthwhile goals. That's how you will get happiness, in that kind of indirect way. Okay, so Schaefer-Landau finds that to be not a persuasive argument against hedonism as a theory of value. The next argument that he considers, he calls the argument from evil pleasures. So the argument would be this. If hedonism is true, then happiness that comes from evil deeds is as good as happiness that comes from kind and decent actions. But happiness that comes from evil deeds is not as good as happiness that comes from kind and decent actions. Therefore, conclusion, hedonism is false. Okay, so is this argument valid? Yes, this is another example of modus tollens. This is another example of the form, if P then Q, but it's not the case that Q, therefore it's not the case that P. So this is an example of modus tollens, and as we said in Lecture 2, modus tollens is a valid form of deductive inference, so this is a valid argument. How is it, though, as an argument against hedonism? Is it a sound argument? That's the question. Well, Schaefer-Landau finds that the argument fails. It fails to show that hedonism is false. It fails because it misconstrues what the hedonist means by good. The hedonist doesn't claim that happiness is, in every case, morally equivalent. The hedonist claims that in every case, happiness is beneficial. So there are lots of ways that something can be good, but they aren't all necessarily the moral sense of good, right? So somebody can be a good baseball player or good at hanging wallpaper. There's good at. Something can taste good, like a dessert can taste good. Something can be good for you in the sense of nutritious. Of course, a dessert like Pop-Tarts that maybe taste good, on the other hand, might not be good for you in the sense that they're not nutritious. Something can be good to look at, like a good painting, or good to watch, like a good movie. There are lots of ways that things can be good, right? Hedonism has to do specifically with ethical goodness. And here again, the hedonist claim is that happiness is the one intrinsically beneficial thing. The one is the good, is the source of value, in the sense that happiness always benefits one. Happiness always makes a life better. Here again, misery clearly hampers a good life, and happiness clearly promotes a good life. So that is the sense in which happiness is good in the context of this philosophical thesis about ethical goodness, about ethical value, this hedonist theory of value that we've been discussing. So Schaefer-Landau thinks that this is not a persuasive argument against hedonism, because here again, the hedonist is just saying that the person who is made happy by good deeds and the person who is made happy by evil pleasures, they are both benefited because happiness is intrinsically beneficial. But it is not morally good in each. It's those two cases of a life being benefited are not morally equally good, is what the hedonist would say. So that is Schaefer-Landau's reply on behalf of hedonism as a theory of value. So is that a good reply to the argument? You'll have to decide for yourself what to think about that. But Schaefer-Landau thinks that there is at least a reply that the hedonist can have to this argument. And it's not clear that the argument shows that hedonism as a theory of value is false. Another argument against hedonism as a theory of value that Schaefer-Landau discusses is what he calls the two worlds argument. Now, this argument is based on a thought experiment. And the thought experiment is this. Imagine two worlds in which there are equal amounts of happiness. But in one world, people are virtuous. And in the other, people are vicious. It has seemed to many that the first world is obviously a better world. Okay, so what do we mean here when we say in the one world people are virtuous? Well, people have traits of character that we think of as virtues. So what do we think of as virtues? Generosity, kindness, courage, wisdom, temperance, that is to say self-control. We think of these traits of character as virtues. And then what does it mean to say that the people in world 2 are vicious? Well, the people in world 2 have vices. What do we mean by vices? They have bad traits of character. So they're dishonest, they're selfish, they're cruel, maybe unreliable, maybe imprudent, maybe unwise. They have many bad traits of character, traits of character that we think of as vices. Okay, but this is the thought. Now this is the thought experiment. Imagine that in those two worlds, people were equally happy. Now, if hedonism is a theory of value were true, then the two worlds would have to be equally good, because hedonism says that happiness is the source of ethical value. But the person presenting this thought experiment, Schaefer-Landau mentions the philosopher William David Ross, W.D. Ross. He presented this thought experiment. It seems to many people like the one world is obviously a better world. So that would seem to show that hedonism is wrong. So that's the thought experiment that the argument is based on. So here's the argument. If hedonism is true, then any two situations containing identical amounts of happiness and unhappiness are equally good. Premise 2. But some such situations are not equally good. Some are better than others. Therefore, conclusion, hedonism is false. So here again, what are the two situations that we're talking about in this argument? World 1 and World 2. In World 1, the people are virtuous. In World 2, the people are vicious. But in both of those worlds, there's an identical amount of happiness and unhappiness. Okay, so if hedonism were true, then in those two situations, those two situations would be equally good. Second premise, those two situations are not equally good. It seems to many people that World 1 clearly is better than World 2. Even if the amounts of happiness are the same, World 1 is still better because the people there have traits of character that we think of as intrinsically good traits of character, like courage and kindness and generosity and wisdom and honesty and so forth. So here again, is this a valid argument? Yes, this is an example of modus tollens. The form of this argument is if P then Q, but it's not the case that Q. Therefore, it's not the case that P. So here again, what is P in this argument? P is hedonism is true. So if you say hedonism is false, you're saying not P. You're saying hedonism is true is not the case. That is to say hedonism is false. Just two different ways of saying the same thing, right? Okay, so as an argument against hedonism, how is this? Well, Schaefer-Landau finds that the argument fails because the hedonist can allow that there are other senses in which something can be good. So his reply on behalf of hedonism here is similar to what we said in the previous argument. There are lots of ways that something can be good. The hedonist only claims that the only kind of moral goodness is happiness. So the hedonist just claims that the only kind of moral goodness is happiness. But of course, the hedonist can recognize that there are other ways that something could be good. So Schaefer-Landau says hedonism is not a theory about all the different ways that one world could be a better world than another. There are other ways that things can be good besides morally good. So that's why Schaefer-Landau does not find this to be a persuasive argument against hedonism. Here again, there are lots of ways that things can be good. Good at, in the sense of somebody can be good at making cabinets, or good at hanging wallpaper, or good at playing baseball. Good for you, in the sense of nutritious food is good for you. Good to taste, in the sense of desserts and other kinds of well-made foods, well-prepared foods are good to taste. Good to look at, in the sense of a good painting or a good sculpture, or good to watch, a good movie. There are lots of things, lots of ways that things can be good, right? Hedonism is a thesis about ethical goodness. It's a thesis about what makes a life a good life, what is beneficial, intrinsically beneficial to a life. And the thesis is that the one source of intrinsic value is pleasure or happiness, pleasure/happiness. Pleasure/happiness always makes a life better off. But the hedonist can recognize that there are other ways that something could be good, and so there are other ways that a world can be good besides being morally good. So Schaefer-Landau finds that this argument, as a criticism of hedonism, this argument fails as well. All right, so the first few arguments against hedonism that Schaefer-Landau considers, he finds to be not persuasive. He finds that in each of these cases, there's always something that the hedonist can say in reply to kind of deflect the argument and show that the hedonist thesis has not really been undermined. But now we start to come into some arguments that it may be hard for hedonism to get around. Certainly that is Schaefer-Landau's conclusion. So he discusses the argument from false happiness, and he finds that this is a harder argument for hedonism to get around. The argument would go like this: if hedonism is true, then our lives go well to the extent that we are happy. But that's not true. It's not the case that our lives go well to the extent that we are happy. Therefore, hedonism is false. So again, a valid argument. Another example of modus tollens. The form of it is if P then Q, but it's not the case that Q, therefore it's not the case that P. That's the basic structure of the argument. I've added a little bit here just to elaborate on what is meant by that statement. Again, the second premise is it's not the case that our lives go well to the extent that we are happy. That's the essential point of the premise. And then just to elaborate on that, a life in which the happiness is based on false beliefs is not as good as a life in which happiness is based on true beliefs. So the essential structure of the argument is just this statement, this first statement, and the conclusion. So again, the form of it is if P then Q, but it's not the case that Q, therefore it's not the case that P. Here again, where P is the statement hedonism is true, so not P, the negation of that would be hedonism is false. Okay, so it's a valid argument. What would be a false happiness scenario? Schaefer-Landau gives us an example on page 36. He says, imagine a woman who is happy in her marriage, partly because she trusts her husband and believes that he has been completely faithful. Suppose her belief is true. Now, imagine another woman who is as happy as the first, and for the same reasons. But, in this case, her belief is false. Her husband has been cheating on her without her knowledge. It seems that the first woman's life is going better for her, and yet these two women are equally happy. Okay, so the point of the argument is that the two women are equally happy, and yet to many people it seems clear that the first life is better than the second. The second life is based on a deception. The happiness is a kind of false happiness. It's a happiness based on a false belief about the truth of what is going on in the woman's life. Now, some students, when we discuss this example, some students will say, well, if they're equally happy, I mean, it really doesn't make a difference. If they're equally happy, if the woman never finds out and she's just as second woman is just as happy as the first one, then the two lives are equally good. That's all there is to it. So that's how some people would react to this argument. That's how hedonists would have to react to the argument. Here again, hedonism says that that happiness is the one intrinsic value, the one intrinsic good. So if two lives are equally happy, they must be equally good on this view. And I do know from experience of discussing this example with a lot of students over the years that some of them do say that if the two lives are equally happy, then it really doesn't make a difference whether the happiness is based on false beliefs or not. So you'll have to decide for yourself what to think about that. But I would say that most students and most readers, I think most people come to the conclusion that the first life is better. It just is a better life if your happiness is based on true beliefs. If your happiness is based on a deception, then that life just is not as good, even though it is an equally happy life. Now, if that is true, then that is evidence for the claim that happiness is not the only intrinsic value. Maybe truth has intrinsic value as well. Yes, we do want to be happy, but I think most of us want our happiness to be based on the truth. We don't just want happiness based on some deception, based on some illusion. We want our happiness to be based on reality. We want it to be based on the truth about our lives. And that seems important. And it seems like that's why most people do say that the first life is a better life than the second one, even though they're equally happy. So this does seem like a more serious argument against hedonism. This argument seems to show that truth has intrinsic value as well, quite apart from happiness. Here again, if the amount of happiness is equal in the two lives, then, and if hedonism were true, then there shouldn't be any basis for picking between the two lives. The two lives should be equally good. So there should be no reason for saying I would prefer one rather than the other. But pretty much everyone I ask in this case says, well, yes, I would prefer to have the first life. Why should that be the case if happiness is the only intrinsic value? Well, perhaps it's not. The point of this argument is that truth has intrinsic value as well, has value quite apart from whether or not it will promote anyone's happiness. So Schaefer-Landau finds that the hedonist may not be able to get around this argument. He writes, a good life is one that is happy, yes, but not only that. Our happiness must be based on reality. A pleasant life of illusion is less good for you than an equally pleasant life based on true beliefs. Okay, so I think a lot of readers would agree with that. I know a lot of students do agree with that. Now, some students, on the other hand, do disagree and do say, no, it doesn't make any difference if the pleasant life is based on false beliefs. Some students will say that a pleasant life of illusion is just as good as a pleasant life based on true beliefs. So I guess there's no simple answer to that question. You'll have to decide for yourself what to think about it. But I think an awful lot of us do believe that here again we would rather have the life if we somehow were behind a veil of ignorance before we came into existence. And God said, here are two possible lives. You can have one or the other. Which one do you want? If the first one is a happy life based on true beliefs, and the second one is a happy life based on a deception, it seems like pretty much everybody would choose the first life. But that seems to show that happiness is not the only intrinsic value then, because if happiness were the only intrinsic value, there would be no way to pick between those two lives. There would be no reason to pick between those two lives. One would be just as good as the other. And yet I think pretty much everyone would pick the first life, which seems to show that truth has intrinsic value as well. Another argument that seems philosophically very substantial, a hard argument for hedonism to get around, is this argument from the importance of autonomy that Schaefer-Landau discusses. What do we mean by autonomy? Being in charge of your life, making your own decisions, running your own life, rather than having someone else make all your decisions for you. it seems like we do want to be in charge of our own lives. And maybe we even want that more than we want happiness. It seems like autonomy has intrinsic value as well. Here again, consider a thought experiment. Imagine somehow it could be shown to you that if you allowed some other person to run your life, to make all your decisions, that life would be happier than a life in which you run your own life and make all your decisions. Sometimes you'll make decisions that will lead you to a certain amount of unhappiness. Suppose that could somehow be shown to you. And here again, suppose you somehow have the opportunity to pick the one life or the other. In the first life, you run your own life. You make your own decisions. You decide for yourself what you want to do with your life. But sometimes you'll make bad decisions and there will be a certain amount of unhappiness in this life. Or the other life that you can have is one in which somebody else makes all your decisions for you, runs your whole life, and you end up having more happiness in that life than in the first life. Okay, those are the two possible lives. Which one would you choose? It seems like here again, pretty much everybody chooses the first one. Which seems to show that autonomy has intrinsic value as well. People don't value only happiness. In fact, some people, it seems like, value autonomy more than happiness. If they had to choose between those two lives, they would choose the one that came with autonomy rather than the one that would have more happiness. So that seems to show that autonomy has intrinsic value as well. So the argument would be this: if hedonism is true, then autonomy contributes to a good life only insofar as it makes us happy. Second premise: that's not true. Autonomy contributes to a good life even when it doesn't make us happy. Therefore, conclusion: hedonism is false. So here again, this is a valid argument. It's a modus tollens. The structure of it is if P then Q, but it's not the case that Q. Therefore, it's not the case that P. Again, P would be hedonism is true. Not P would be hedonism is false. That's just a way of denying the first statement, isn't it? So it's a valid argument. As an argument against autonomy, how is it? Well, Schaefer-Landau finds that hedonism cannot account for the importance of autonomy. He says, when we consider the lives of those who have been deprived of their autonomy, we see the absence of a great value. Even if it could somehow be done in a way, even if someone's autonomy could be taken away in such a way that they would still be happy, it still seems to us like that is a less good life now that the person is not making his own decisions or running her own life. Schaefer-Landau gives some examples of this starting on page 37. Towards the bottom of page 37, he gives this example. He gives the example of the novel Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. He says, consider the inhabitants of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Huxley created a fictional society in which war, poverty, and emotional distress have all disappeared. Okay, that sounds pretty good so far, doesn't it? So far, that sounds fine. But he goes on to explain, how have such things been achieved? The rulers have introduced a pacifying drug called soma, which all citizens must take. Books and shows that may upset people have been banned. Close relationships are forbidden, so as to prevent the heartache that comes from the loss of a friendship or a loved one. So the reason there's no unhappiness in this world is that everybody is on a drug. Now, this drug takes away their autonomy. As Schaefer-Landau says, the citizens of this brave new world have become complacent animals, obedient to the political masters who are intent on manipulating them. So this is a society in which people are happy. There is no unhappiness, but they're unhappy because they're happy because they're drugged. As Schaefer-Landau says, they've been turned into complacent animals by this drug. So that does not seem like a society that any of us would want to live in, does it? That seems to show that, here again, we value autonomy maybe even more than we value happiness. Maybe happiness, here again, hedonism says that happiness is the only intrinsic value, but maybe that's not true. Maybe autonomy is an intrinsic value as well. And it seems like some of us maybe even value that more than happiness. Schaefer-Landau also discusses what he calls paternalism. This is on page 39. He talks about how we all resent paternalism. He says it's a good thing to be able to exercise autonomous choice. And this explains what is objectionable about paternalism. Someone's limiting your liberty against your will, but for your own good. So he goes on to give a number of examples here: a society of arranged marriages, forced career choices, anti-gambling legislation, motorcycle helmet laws. All of that might lead to greater happiness. But he goes on to say, we lose the opportunity, though, to take chances, to risk our happiness, to exercise real freedom. Manipulation and paternalism, even when done in a way that gains us happiness, are still objectionable to some extent, and that is because they sacrifice something of intrinsic value, namely autonomy. So let's just focus on the first of those examples. Let's just focus on the example of arranged marriage. Most of us would not want to enter into an arranged marriage. That is a common tradition, that is a common custom, that is a customary tradition in many parts of the world, more traditional parts of the world. But as Americans, we're used to autonomy. We value our individual liberty. We value making our own decisions, running our own lives. This is distinctive to our culture. It's distinctive to Western culture. And I think most of us would not want our parents to decide who we are going to marry. I think most of us would want to make that decision for ourselves, which here again shows that we value autonomy. And again, Schaefer-Landau's point with that is that we always resent paternalism. That is to say, we resent someone telling us, somebody with power over us, some authority, whether it's our parents or the government. We always resent someone in authority telling us, you can't do something because we know better than you do what will make you happy. We know better than you do what will be good for you. Therefore, we won't let you do something. Whatever it is. We tend to resent that. We tend to resent paternalism. We tend to resent people telling us on what we cannot do or what we must do on the justification that they know better than we do what will make us happy or what will be good for us. We tend to resent that. Why is that? Why do we resent paternalism? Because we value autonomy. We see autonomy as having intrinsic value. We just do want to run our own lives. We just do want to make our own decisions. And here again, it may be the case that we value that even more than we value happiness. Even if it could somehow, let's just stick with the example of arranged marriage for a moment. Even if it could somehow be shown to you that your chances of being happier happy in an arranged marriage was greater than your chance of deciding for yourself who to marry, even if that could somehow be shown. Still, I think most of us would want to make the decision for ourselves. And I think that here again is evidence for what the critic of hedonism is saying here. The critic of hedonism is saying here there are other things that are intrinsically valuable. Autonomy is intrinsically valuable. We value it too for its own sake, and maybe even more so than happiness. So this does seem like a substantial argument against hedonism. It's hard to see how the hedonist can get around this argument. Here again, consider, if you had to choose between a life in which you were kept in drug-induced happiness, like the Brave New World scenario, and were powerless to run your own life, or a life in which you freely choose your course of action, but risk unhappiness in doing so, which would you choose? In my experience, pretty much everybody wants the life in which they make their own decisions, even if there's a greater risk of unhappiness. So that seems to show that autonomy has intrinsic value as well, not only happiness. And that seems to show that many of us indeed value autonomy even more than happiness. Schaefer-Landau also presents what he calls the argument from life's trajectory. So the argument would be that if hedonism is true, then the quality of a life depends entirely on the amount of happiness it contains. The second premise, however, is that that's not true. The quality of a life depends on its trajectory as well. Therefore, hedonism is false. So again, that's a modus tollens. If P then Q, but it's not the case that Q. Therefore, it's not the case that P. That's a valid argument. So what do we mean here by life's trajectory? Well, we mean the direction of the life. Is the direction upward or downward? So Schaefer-Landau gives some examples. On page 40, he says, consider the sad case of Delmore Schwartz, a brilliant writer and conversationalist who served as the basis of the title character in Saul Bellows' novel, Humboldt's Gift. Schwartz earned many awards early in his career and taught at Princeton and Harvard for several years. But his last decade was spent in increasing frustration and isolation, addicted to alcohol and drugs, and experiencing increasingly severe paranoia and mental illness. He died alone in a seedy hotel in Times Square. The promise of his early years left unfulfilled. So that would be an example of a downward trajectory. His life started off great, but it just kept going downhill, and it ended up very badly. That's one possible trajectory of a life. Another possible trajectory is that it might start off badly, but then get better and keep getting better and end up being a very happy life. Schaefer-Landau says, imagine a person whose early life was all heartache and hardship. Jane Eyre or Oliver Twist, for instance. So he gives these examples from novels. Maybe you've read those novels, maybe you haven't. Or from real life, perhaps someone like Mary Carr, whose memoir, The Liars' Club, portrays a childhood about as miserable as can be. In such lives, the suffering eventually yields to happiness and many years of satisfaction and pleasure. So those would be lives with an upward trajectory. I don't know if you're familiar with any of those examples. What would be another example? Maybe the story of Michael Orr, if you've seen The Blind Side, the movie about Michael Orr, the football player. Of course, his life started off very rough, but it got better over time, and ultimately it ended up being a very good life. He got to play football at Ole Miss, and then, of course, got to be a professional football player, and ended up having a very good life. So that would be another example of an upward trajectory. So it seems like we do want the trajectory of our lives to be upward. We don't want it to be downward. Now, if all that mattered in life was the quantity of happiness, just the amount of happiness, then it shouldn't matter whether the trajectory is upward or downward. Take two lives. Let's suppose one has a downward trajectory. It starts off great and then just keeps going, getting worse until it ends up very badly. And then consider another life that has an upward trajectory. It starts off very bad, but then gets better and keeps getting better, and at the end is a great life. Now let's suppose those two lives had exactly, though, the same amount of happiness in them, exactly the same quantity of happiness in them. Which would you choose? It seems like everybody would choose the life with the upward trajectory. For whatever reason, we just do want to have that upward trajectory in life. So Schaefer-Landau finds that hedonism cannot account for the importance of life's trajectory. Here again, why is that important to us? I don't know. It's an interesting question, isn't it? But it is important to us. And that seems to show that other things are important to us than just the amount of happiness in a life. If you had to choose between two lives, and they'll have the same quantity of happiness, but one starts off bad and gets better, the other starts off good but then just keeps getting worse, which would you choose? It seems like everyone would choose the first one. In my experience, pretty much everyone would choose the first one. So that seems to show here again that there is a kind of intrinsic value to having an upward trajectory of life. There is a kind of intrinsic value to having a certain trajectory of life. It isn't only the amount of happiness in life that matters to us. That seems to show that happiness is not the only intrinsic value. Schaefer-Landau also presents what he calls the argument for multiple harms. And the argument would go like this: if hedonism is true, then you can be harmed by something only because it saddens you. Second premise, though, that's not true. You can be harmed in other ways. Therefore, conclusion, hedonism is not true. That is to say, hedonism is false. So again, in modus tollens, the form of it is if P then Q, but it's not the case that Q. Therefore, it's not the case that P. So he gives some examples. On page 41, he gives this example. Consider an Olympic marathon runner who is poised to bring home gold. She has trained for years for this event. Suppose that she pulls a hamstring the day before the race and is unable to compete. All that work to no end. She's devastated. Why does this reaction make sense? It seems well explained if we assume that the development of our talents is important in its own right. This athlete sees that something terrible has happened, and that is why she is unhappy. What's most regrettable in her case isn't her unhappiness, it's the destruction of her talents. After all, would everything be fine if someone slipped her a soma pill? That is to say, if she, after this devastating experience, took a drug that then made her happy, would everything be fine now? It seems like the answer to that is no. I mean, something very regrettable still has happened. And the fact that she's maybe on a drug that makes her happy now wouldn't undo, it seems like that wouldn't undo the badness of what happened, right? It would still be a very bad thing to have happened. Now, of course, she is very unhappy at the fact that her talents went unfulfilled. She was capable of winning the race, maybe, but was unable to compete because of this unfortunate last-minute injury. And so all those years of training and preparation, they weren't brought to their completion. They weren't brought to their fulfillment. She didn't fulfill her potential, and that does seem like a bad thing to have happen to you. Seems like a bad thing to happen to anyone. But it's not, and it's true that the individual would be unhappy if that happened. But does that really explain the bad? Does the unhappiness here, does it explain the badness of what has happened? Schaefer-Landau's point is that it doesn't. There are other things that are intrinsically valuable besides happiness, and one of those things is the fulfillment of your potential, the realization of your potential, the fulfillment of your potentiality, what he calls here the development of our talents. That's something that has importance in its own right. So there are other ways that you can be harmed besides being saddened. Here again, it's true that you would be saddened by an event like that, but that doesn't seem to explain the badness of what has happened. Again, if somebody immediately after it happened gave you a drug that made you happy, would that undo the badness of what had happened? No, it seems like all those years of training, all those years of work, it just seems like they should, ideally, they should find their completion, their fulfillment. You should fulfill the potentiality for what the potential that you had to do this great thing. And the fact that opportunity was taken away from you in an abrupt way at the last moment, it just seems like that's an intrinsically bad thing, quite aside from any unhappiness that it might produce. He gives this example towards the bottom of 41. Consider how reasonable it is to be saddened at the death of a dear friend. Such things diminish our happiness, but they do so only because our happiness in these and so many other cases depends on our appreciating what has value in its own right. So he's saying, if you were to imagine here you were to lose your best friend, it's true you would be saddened by that, but does the sadness of it really explain the badness of what has happened there? Schaefer-Landau's point is, no, it doesn't really seem to. It seems like the badness of what has happened there has to do with the intrinsic value of your friendship and the intrinsic value of the person who was your friend. You would think of all the good that your friend did in the world, all the goodness that he brought in or she brought into the world, and knowing that all of that is gone now, knowing that that person isn't contributing to the world, all of the good things, all of the positive things that he or she did, that just is bad. there's a kind of intrinsic value to the person. There's a kind of intrinsic value to your friend that explains the badness of the loss of a friend. It's true you would be very saddened, but the sadness doesn't explain the badness of what has happened. The intrinsic value of the person, the intrinsic value of the friendship, quite apart from any happiness that it might produce. It's the loss of that that seems to explain the badness of what has happened in that case. So Schaefer-Landau finds that it isn't always the unhappiness of a loss that lessens our well-being. Sometimes the unhappiness is, as he says, a symptom of the loss of something that all by itself matters to our well-being. So the intrinsic value of a friendship, or here again, the intrinsic value of the development of one's talents, to have these things taken away would be bad. And it's true that we would be unhappy in those cases, but again, the unhappiness would be a symptom of the loss. The unhappiness wouldn't explain the badness of the loss itself. The unhappiness would be kind of a side effect. So the unhappiness doesn't really seem to explain the loss of the intrinsic value in the world in those cases, which here again seems to show that happiness is not the only intrinsic value. It's not the only intrinsically good thing.